Hello, I'm Angela McKinney with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I'm here today with Dr. George Batsche from the University of South Florida, and we're talking a little bit about multi-tiered systems of support. So, Dr. Batsche, talk to me a little bit about MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support. That's a relatively new term for Indiana.
Yeah, it's a relatively new term for the nation as well. And some people wonder how MTSS relates to response to intervention, or RTI, or vice versa. And actually, the term MTSS has been around for a while, but the U.S. Department of Education began using it a few years ago to basically describe a system of teaching and supports that is intensified based upon student need. And we've always had an education, general education, remedial education, special education. So we've always had this multi-tiered system of supports. But with the research showing that the most effective instruction for students is instruction that is designed to meet the specific needs of students, that when that happens, that students grow, accelerating their performance a lot more quickly than if we just use generic approaches for kids who are struggling. So a multi-tiered system of supports has a number of critical elements to it, but probably the ones that would be of most interest for this conversation is literally, what do the tiers look like? Mm-hmm. How do we determine what it is we do in those tiers? And a problem-solving process is used to answer the questions: what do we want our students to know, understand, and do? Why aren't they doing it? If we can find out the why will tell us the how to deal with it. So the third step is, what are we going to do about it? But whenever we do instruction intervention, whether it's academic or behavior, although we have a good idea that out of that problem-solving process, this is going to be a benefit to the student, we're never 100% sure or to what degree the student benefits. So the last step of it is, how well did it work? Mm-hmm. So this system clearly uses student-centered data to determine what it is that student needs. How are we going to determine what to do? And use the same data to find out whether or not it worked. So a multi-tiered system of supports, tier one is general education. It's what all students get. It is the general education curriculum. It's the school-wide behavioral supports. It's universal design for learning supports that all students can benefit from to help their learning, like computer-assisted instruction or text-to-speech for students who can't read as quickly as other students. And those tiers, if a student is doing well in tier one, great. If a student is not, teachers typically differentiate for that student in tier one. And when they find that that level of differentiation that they're able to do with 20 or 25 students in a class is not sufficient, then we want to intensify the instruction. So intensifying instruction means we add more time. The student gets more instruction. Academic engaged time, the amount of time students engage instruction, whether it's academics or behavior, mm-hmm. is very strongly related to how quickly students improve. Time is like the coin of the realm, if you will, but only time that is used to expose students to quality instruction. So we increase the time. We narrow the focus of that instruction specifically to the need that that student has. You know, it's often said a student can't read at grade level. And some people interpret that to mean that the student can't read, which isn't the case. Even students who are struggling with reading have reading skills. And we need to focus the instruction on those skills that are barriers to the student reading at grade level or whatever the focus is. And the third area is we might modify the type of instruction. So instruction for students who struggle often needs to be more explicit. It needs to be guided. Students need to receive a lot of feedback. They need more practice. And so clearly those are things that might take more time. But that time is well spent because if we can accelerate the student's performance, The goal is to get the student within the range where that student can be successful with less intensive instruction. Some students have to stay with more intensive instruction for a longer period of time, but really the goal is, how do we get the student over those humps that are barriers to learning? So really, the multi-tiered part of this is simply how we deliver instruction. There's no magic to it. There's Tier 1. Tier 2 is that next supplemental level. Tier 3 is really very intensive instruction. That's for students who haven't responded as we had hoped for with Tier 1 or Tier 2. Some people have confused intensive instruction with what special education students receive. And that really is not true. Actually, the data from multi-tiered systems across the country tell us that more than 60% of the students receiving intensive instruction are not students with disabilities.
So where does special ed fit into this?
That's a great question. The U.S. Department of Education made it very clear when they published their multi-tiered system of supports graphic, with the bottom being Tier 1. Tier 2 is supplemental instruction, designated usually by the color yellow. Intensive instruction is what the fewest number of students get, designed for 5–6% of the students. As you move up the tiers, we intensify instruction based upon your response to the lower level of instruction. So if the student is not responding as well as we had hoped, we would intensify that instruction further. At some point, the question becomes, is this student's lack of progress potentially due to a disability? And so students with disabilities actually fall into two categories of service in schools. Some students who have a disability are on 504 plans, where they receive accommodations to help reduce or neutralize the impact of their disability on learning. For students who have a disability and require specially designed instruction and other supports, those students are eligible for special education. So in schools, we have students with disabilities who are not in special education,
right.
And they're getting accommodations. But for the ones who are in special education, they are there because they require specially designed instruction. And that instruction is designed to reduce or to eliminate barriers to learning that typically is a result of that disability. So one of the questions that is contained, really, or the statements contained in a new memo from the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, is that it's important for IEP teams to understand how a disability is serving as a barrier to learning for students. Once you understand the how, you can then understand the why and develop that specially designed instruction. But students who are eligible for special education services are no different than any other students. Some of those students, their disability has a lesser of an effect or lesser of a barrier, and less intensive instruction can actually serve that student well. Some students are receiving services in general education because the special education teacher is consulting with the general education teacher, but not necessarily working directly with the student. Other students with disabilities require a tremendous amount of time and specially designed instruction and many supports based upon the impact of their disability on that learning process. So because of that, we have students receiving special education services whose needs can be met with very little additional work in Tier 1 or general ed, and some receiving very intensive instruction. No different than any other students. So special ed fits into the entire range of tiers. It is not a separate tier. It is not Tier 4. Students with disabilities absolutely are general education kids first. And special education, remedial education, these are services that we provide to students and families to help kids be successful in general education. Because the amount of supports available in the community at large and the range of those supports are not nearly at the intensity of availability outside of school as they are inside of school. So we say very clearly that we think Tier 1 or general education is kind of the reality show. If students can be successful with supports in general education, then that bodes very well for them post-secondary. And one of our goals with students in high school, late middle school and high school, is to develop transition plans so that students can acquire the capacity themselves to advocate for the supports that they need as adults to be successful. And that's a very important process. The degree to which we do not increase the capacity of students to advocate for themselves, to identify the supports and find those supports, then we are enabling students to require services outside of school that are often not there. And this is one of the reasons why they struggle, is because they do not necessarily have the capacity to problem solve. Because that's an acquired skill and that has to be taught. And I think sometimes we are so committed to students with disabilities succeeding that we often forget that the student themselves may offer their greatest strength to their future, and that they may need us a little less than we may think they need us. So we have to trust in these students as they get older. And once again, they're no different than any other students who have to take on increased awareness and responsibility and figure out how to move through life successfully. They just need extra supports in the process.
What would you say are probably the biggest barriers to student success?
I think a couple of things. The biggest one is a system that doesn't have the supports or the use of data or the assessments in place to identify a student before they already fail. We have to remember that once students are behind, a fourth grade student reading at the second grade level, even if they accelerate their performance to where they're no longer falling behind, they have 2 years of a gap to make up. What that means is that these students have to grow as fast as others and make up some of the gap. So what we're really asking students who struggle or students with disabilities to do who are behind is outperform, grow faster than all the other kids in their classroom who don't have those struggles or those disabilities. So the gift that schools can give to their students is using the technology, using the assessments. We call them early warning systems. There's a variety of names for them. We can actually identify students who have yet to fail, who are likely to fail in the future, and put supports in place before that failure happens. It's no different than if you're predisposed to heart disease. You know that. You know there are certain things you can do to prevent a heart attack. You don't have to have a heart attack. It's not a good early warning system. Sometimes it's the final warning system. Yet we know that there are many indicators ahead of time, if we just pay attention to them, that we don't have to get to that point. So I think schools attending to having early warning systems, using data to identify students before they fail, so that the student doesn't have to work 50%, grow 50% faster than students who are not struggling, just in order to catch up, because it's very difficult for that to happen. So I think that is the first thing that's critical for student success. I think the other thing is critical is letting students know on a frequent basis how they're doing. If they're too young, ensuring that the adults know how they're doing. We call it progress monitoring, formative assessment, whatever. If you're on a weight loss program and you're going to the gym and you're changing your diet, you really want to know every week whether this is working. Actually, those things require a huge amount of work and effort, and most people probably prefer not to have to do them. So in order for us to maintain our motivation to do it and demonstrate that this is working, we need to know that we're getting results. Children are no different. They know when they're not doing well. And every little bit of information they have to know that they are now doing better than they were is critical to their engagement in this process. And although collecting data takes additional time, the more that students become motivated and engaged in that learning process, the less of a burden or less of a responsibility is for teachers to do the whole thing. So the data has a lot of advantages, but one of the greatest is increasing the self-efficacy of students, how they feel about themselves. All of us want to know we're doing better. And in education, typically only educators have the data to know if you're doing better. So I think those two things, if you ask me for two, I will give you those two things. If we did that well, we would see students having a lot more success.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the recent OSER's memo that came out.
Sure. The OSER's memo, that's the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, which is the part of the U.S. Department of Education that the Office of Special Education Programs is in, which is the office that has to do with special education in public schools. Came out with a memo, I think it was November 16th, that basically said the instruction that we give, that specially designed instruction for students who are enrolled in special education, has to be aligned with the standards adopted by the state-approved grade level standards in reading, math, science, what have you. And IEPs serve a couple of purposes. One is that they really are a contract between the school district and the family for services that are going to be provided to a student with a disability who requires specially designed instruction and related services. They are also supposed to be a roadmap for that instruction that is provided. But one of the things that we have to remember is that instruction given in isolation physically, or instruction given in isolation from the standards that students are assessed against, high-stakes testing, end-of-year tests, then if that isolation happens, students receiving special education services may actually be improving in their learning. But if it's not learning that's aligned with the standards that guides the assessment, then our students with disabilities are not going to show that learning on assessments that are aligned with standards that their instruction is not aligned with. I know that sounds very confusing and kind of circular, but the new standards that most states are adopting, whether they're Common Core or the state version of Common Core or something like it. One of the cool things about Common Core is it really has amped up the rigor of these standards. And we really are not focusing on skills directly. We want students to have skills in math and science and reading. Clearly they have to have those. But the focus of these standards is how to think, problem solving, critical thinking, reasoning. So how do you use those skills to solve problems? How do you use those skills to create new knowledge? All of the things that are really important to our society. And often with kids with disabilities, IEPs focus just on the skills. But they don't focus on how those skills are going to improve a student's access to the content in the standards. And when that happens, kids and teachers are working hard, but you don't see the positive outcomes in Tier 1. So this memo has basically said IEPs must be aligned with the state-approved grade level standards appropriate to that student. The memo also reminds us directly that special education students are general education kids first, and reminds us of the research that says students with disabilities can achieve grade level standards. And sometimes we think that that's not possible. And if we take it outside the realm of education, we have so many role models in our society of individuals with disabilities that have achieved the highest standards of their profession. And examples of excellence in everything they do. So why we think that students with disabilities can't achieve grade level standards has always been a bit of a struggle. But clearly, those grade level standards and measured by those high stakes assessments requires that what we teach them is aligned with the standards so that what they take on those tests, they have been taught to do. If that's not aligned, then they're going to look like they haven't learned when in fact they may have. So that second part of that standard is very important. The third thing that I have as a takeaway from it is it talks about the responsibility for educating students with disabilities must be shared by all of us. So often in IEP meetings, you will find the parent, the special ed teacher, maybe a psychologist or a speech therapist or someone, but often general education teachers are not present. And the best friend a special education teacher can have is a general education teacher. The best friend a general education teacher can have is a special education teacher of a student they share. And the special education teacher knowing what that teacher is working on that week. Pre-teaching, review, and reteaching is a very important strategy. So if our special education and other support teachers are teaching to the standard that is aligned with the time when that is being covered in the general ed class, then we know that students with disabilities improve a lot more quickly because they're actually getting instruction that is integrated. Regardless of where the student is, everybody's focusing on the same thing and the same strategies. So there is a lot in that memo that is going to move our IEP process to be much more integrated with Tier 1 instructional design, aligned with standards, so that when our students with disabilities take those high-stakes tests, they are as prepared as our students in general education to do that. But we can't do it if the IEP is focusing on something other than the standard.
Right.
So I applaud. I have said I just was jumping up and down with joy when I saw that memo saying our IEPs have to be aligned with standards, because I thought now this barrier has been knocked down. It will take a while, though, for us to learn how to incorporate that. I'm familiar with the work of the IEPRC here in Indiana. They've done phenomenal work in the IEP area. And I've seen their progression charts and relating it to general education. So I think Indiana is well poised to simply take and link what they're doing to that standard. So one of the things that we've looked at is a pretty simple process. IEP meetings would begin with stating the standard that we want that student to be able to attain. Breaking down that standard into what the student needs to know and what the student needs to do. Identifying the skills necessary to gain the knowledge and perform the task. And then saying, what about this student's disability? Is putting that student at risk for the specific skills necessary to demonstrate the standard. And once we do that, the doors are going to open widely to students demonstrating that they can in fact attain standards. No student, whether they have a disability or not, can attain a standard that they necessarily have not been taught explicitly to do. So I think this is wonderful news, and I'm really excited. And I'm really looking at Indiana to be able to kind of lead this a little bit, because your IEP process is just poised to do it.
I know we get to have you back for the Focus on Inclusion conference in February.
Yes.
And I'm excited about your keynote. So maybe you can...
I actually haven't written it yet, but hopefully it'll meet your expectation. No. Yeah, I think we're focusing on what is special about special education.
Yes.
And I really, and that's something that is a term that a lot of people are asking the question, so that's why we picked it for the keynote. I really wish we could talk about what is special about education for students with disabilities. Special education is one part of it, but it is really the degree to which all of what education does integrates and wraps around for students with disabilities. I feel badly. I've been doing this a long time. this work a long time. I feel badly when parents and general educators, principals, psychologists, and others, once a student is found eligible for special education, if they really expect the special education teacher alone to fix a problem that nobody had been able to do until that time. So students with disabilities need all hands on deck. When we are all committed to doing our part, general education, remedial education, counseling, psychology, speech, PT, OT, parents, special education teachers, when we each do a small amount focused on a common goal, then students with disabilities will progress very, very well. If we expect one person or one service to do that, then it's simply not going to happen.
Right.
I was trying to find something more positive to say, but I can't. It's not going to happen. And students with learning disabilities often spend maybe an hour a day in specially designed instruction. 60 minutes, they spend about 330 or 400 minutes a day in school. So the idea of how something given in 60 minutes can truly take care of things that are needed for another 300 a day is not. Even common sense doesn't tell us that that's going to work. So this OSER's memo really talked about this being a shared responsibility. I think it's going to change who's at IEP meetings. Or at an IEP meeting, it'll be followed up by general education teachers, special ed, and support teachers meeting to co-plan their lessons to be sure that their pacing is in line with each other so that they're not doing this kind of stuff. I don't think there's one way to do this as long as the intent of that memo. The intent of the memo is not another regulation. It is driven by practices that are known to accelerate the performance of students with disabilities, and that's why it's there.
Well, I appreciate your time, and we appreciate your knowledge and expertise and being able to share such cutting-edge information with us.
Well, I'm excited to be here in Indiana, and I've learned a lot about what you're doing, and it's really good stuff, and it's ready to go to the next level.
We're ready.
Good.
Thank you.